listening to the Film Monsters Podcast with Nate and Ray.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Film Monsters Podcast. I'm Nate. And unfortunately, Ray, we're ending our little 5-episode stint about A24. I don't know about you, but it has been a lot of fun to sit around and nerd out about A24. It's been like a highlight of my week, especially like going back through and revisiting Lamb and watching Last Black Man in San Francisco again, talking about a lot of those films that or the directors we discussed last week. It's just been really fun because I know we both are really passionate about A24, and it's been really cool to talk about like some of the more popular films in their catalog, but also some of the more obscure stuff that we love, because I feel like we don't always get an opportunity. Like I know you said with Lamb, when that movie came out, you didn't really have an opportunity to talk to a lot of people about it because they haven't seen it. And so for me, it's cool to get to have these conversations with you and also share them with the audience, so maybe they can explore and find out a movie that maybe they wouldn't have checked out otherwise if it wasn't for the podcast.
Exactly. I don't know. I feel like with A24 too, it's starting to become such a household name that a lot of more people are paying attention to A24. So hopefully there's a way to let people know, it's like, hey, yes, we love everything everywhere all at once, but there's like a huge array of A24 out there of all different styles, genres, and yeah, hopefully we're piquing some people's interest. I know that I'm stoked with a lot of the movies you have mentioned throughout these past few episodes.
Today, actually, Ray and I, as we announced last week, we're going to, in today's episode, talk about A24's horror films, and we're going to do it in more of like a loose format. It's not going to be like a, hey, Ray and I picked a list of blah, blah, blah. It's going to be more just like, here are some horror films that A24's put out that we like, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. But I thought it would be fun, Ray, because the spooky season is approaching. We're about to segue ourselves into talking about all these different horror topics that we've been discussing. And so I thought it would be fun before we got the episode started today. Is there a horror film that you love? And I know how much you love Night of the Living Dead, but is there a horror movie that you watch right before the spooky season starts to kind of get you in the zone for the season? Like, is there like a segue film for you, or something that you put on that just like really gets you in that mood for Halloween, for the month of October, that just gets you excited for that feeling that we get around this time of year?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I feel like for me, so what I do is I usually try to compile, if for anybody that knows me, I'm a kind of like Rob Gordon from High Fidelity. I do a lot of top 5 compilation lists, except for me, it's like I go overboard because I'm not a normal person, and I will put together like lists of movies to watch throughout the year. So throughout the month of October. So I feel like whatever movies that I really badly wanted to include on my list that didn't quite make it are the ones that I end up watching. I also like visiting like classics, like you have your Army of Darkness, or you have your Evil Dead, or even just like the Lost Boys, movies like that are like classic that I have to watch at least once a year. So if those for whatever reason didn't make my rotation for October, I'll throw those in. But I don't think I have like a specific one. I think it's just more of like, I just like to slowly start creeping in just the movies that I watch all the time. You know how there's those movies that you just have to watch no matter what to get you into the spooky season. I feel like usually those are the ones that I start watching to get myself in the mood, because once the spooky season comes in, I try to throw in movies that I haven't seen to kind of expose myself to other stuff. So this year I picked a bunch that I haven't actually seen. I feel like I'm gonna hear pretty soon, I'm gonna start putting on like the Army of Darkness with this 4K restoration that's coming. Another one that's always a must this time of year is obviously Trick or Treat, which is coming to theaters. I'm excited about that. I feel like my answer isn't that specific, it's super vague, but because I don't have a specific one, I will just throw in all the classics that I've always loved and cherished.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you mentioned it just now, because I'm in the similar vein as you, where like every time spooky season comes around, I feel like there's movies I gravitate towards. Like I've talked about it a million times on this podcast, but like I love Evil Dead 2. It's one of my favorite films ever made. But it's funny because you just mentioned it. I love Trick or Treat. And I feel like the past couple of years, I've actually added Trick or Treat into my rotation a lot heavier around this time of year because I feel like it just like bleeds that vibe. It really feels just like a straightforward Halloween movie that just has the atmosphere nailed down. The score is amazing, and I feel like that's a movie that I really gravitate towards when this time comes around because it just gets my mind in that place and just puts me in an area that excites me for the holiday season. And I just think it's so much fun because I mean obviously we all have like our go-tos. Like you have Night of the Living Dead, which is like a perfect movie to get you in the mood for that. I over the past couple years have fallen more and more in love with Carnival of Souls. That's another movie that really puts me in the mood for the spooky season. And I don't know, I just thought that'd be a fun thing to discuss, and I think you gave a really good answer because I know it's hard. There's so many amazing movies out there, and there's so many incredible films that I get so excited about when this time of year comes around. And it's more difficult than you think to just pick one. And I'm looking forward for this year to watch a whole bunch, and I know we're going to have a lot to talk about when we start up. But Ray, I know you were talking to me before the podcast about another horror affiliated discussion you wanted to have, and I really like this idea, and I think it's really cool.
Oh, right. Yeah, we were talking about this before we got on. As we approach the spooky season, I figure that this last episode of A24 where we're going to talk about horror could be like we were talking about, a good segue into October, which is going to be all horror. We're going to be all out in horror. And it's kind of like I saw the band Copeland do this live one time, and I kind of like what they did. He was like, Aaron Marsh was like, hey, this is our last song. We are going to play an encore, but in order to save time, we're not going to get off stage. We're just going to keep playing. So I kind of took that that little experience, and I'm like, as we're finishing this horror episode of A24, I figured we're not going to take an encore. We can just talk right now a little bit about what horror means to us. So that way, starting October, we can just be in full swing with some of the topical episodes that we have picked up. So I figure we can spend a few minutes talking about what horror means to us. And I don't know, what does horror mean to you, Nate?
Yeah, it's such a difficult question. I feel like so many people have asked me this over the years, and it's hard when you have something that you love so deeply to like 100% put it to words. But I guess for me, like, when I was a really young kid, I was scared of everything. I know, like, especially when I was like 5, 6 years old. I remember my mom put on the original 13 Ghosts when I was like 5 or 6, and it scared the crap out of me to where I couldn't even sleep. And you watch that movie now, and it's just so cheesy and over the top, and things don't scare me as much anymore. And for a very long time at a young age, I had a hard time gravitating towards horror because I was just so afraid of a lot of what the world had to offer. And I think a lot of that comes to my religious upbringing, and a lot of that, like, there's just a lot of things that scared me through the years. And honestly, I think what has made me gravitate towards the horror genre so much is like the trauma that I've experienced in my life, and like the issues that I have with mental health, and a lot of those things. I feel like the best horror filmmakers that exist now kind of put the trauma that they've experienced in their own lives on screen, and like will add a supernatural element or like some kind of a spin to it, to where it's not completely just like, okay, you're watching a factual representation of someone's struggle. It's elevated into a horror format. Like, I mean, even if you want to look at some of the more big budget horror films over the years, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, when you look at the source material, when Stephen King said that he wrote The Shining because he was having nightmares, and that these nightmares were so vivid they were coming to life, and he put that down on paper, and then Stanley Kubrick took that source material and kind of flipped it to how it resonated with him. And like even big budget films like that, Wes Craven, Nightmare on Elm Street, like he was suffering horrible nightmares and dealing with all these awful things and wanted to find a way to convey that into the screen. Like you see something that simple, and then you look at films now now, like you look at like Ari Aster's Midsommar, which we can talk about when we talk about the A24 horror films, and how a lot of that comes from his own personal life and dealings with relationships. And so I think seeing people's trauma on screen and like knowing that someone out there goes through something similarly to you, but is able to put it on screen in a more fantastical way, there's just something that I resonate with that. And I think that's truly why I love horror so much. And what's the answer for you, Ray? Why do you love horror so much?
So I think I'm in a similar boat as you. I grew up. I think the big difference though is that even though I grew up in a fairly religious family, my dad was always really drawn to horror. So my dad had all these horror movies, and I would sneak in and watch them, or I would get up late at night and watch the edited versions on TV while my parents were asleep. And I used to be scared to death of them, to the point where I think I've told this story before, where my dad just kind of one night stayed up with me watching the Night of the Living Dead, and just kind of, in a way, took the magic out of it by explaining everything away, from makeup effects to all of that good stuff. But I think horror for me is something that, I don't know, I've never, like, I always joke around on the podcast, I'm like, I'm not a normal person. But I do feel like deep down, like a lot of horror fans, a lot of people that have grown up with this type of material, like, we do sincerely feel like we're not normal people, like we're not part of like the cliche clean cut kids out there. I even to this day, there's people that look at me like, how can you watch horror? I was actually joking with someone at work yesterday, and I was like, oh yeah, like I will put on a horror movie to go to sleep,
Yeah, I'm the same way.
And then they look at me like I'm insane. Like, wait, you watch? I had this experience the other day. I was watching. I couldn't sleep, and I put on The Evil Dead. Like, I literally fell asleep, and I opened my eyes, and it's that iconic scene where he's beheading his girlfriend. And I opened my eyes, and he just has the chainsaw, and it's just like beheading and blood squirting everywhere. And I just kind of like put the pillow and just kind of got comfortable and fell back asleep to the sound of this woman screaming.
That's hysterical. I really like that we both kind of fall in the same way too, Ray, about this. And I think what's interesting about what you're saying about like, being drawn to this genre and how like people are seemingly, outcast. I was listening to a podcast recently, and I thought this was really fascinating, and I thought I'd share it on here. I originally was going to save it for the Halloween episodes, but I think it's pertinent to what we're discussing now, is that if you look back at the history of horror and you look at the original Frankenstein and The Invisible Man and The Bride of Frankenstein, some of the earliest horror films in history, those movies were directed by a guy named James Whale. And in literally the early 20s and 30s, he was an openly gay director. And which I can only imagine what that would be like in that time period. And the reason why he was interested in doing Frankenstein and The Invisible Man and The Bride of Frankenstein, he did this incredible film that, Ray, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's called The Old Dark House, and it's absolutely amazing. It's like one of the greatest early horror films ever made. But he was very interested in taking these characters that are considered outcasts or strange or freaks and paint them through a very different light, because he was an openly gay person in like the 20s and 30s, which was like completely and totally frowned upon in the United States at that time period. And he wanted those characters to be representative of people in the gay community. Because, I mean, if you think Frankenstein's monster is really a misunderstood character. He didn't choose to be created. He didn't choose to be this big, giant, towering thing that people found evil. And there's this core heart to Frankenstein's monster. And I think that horror has always had provided this platform for people of color, the LGBTQ community, like all the people in our community that have like through the years faced adversity or been considered outcasts or strange. And it's really just been a beautiful way to bring people together. I remember a couple months ago, my wife and I went and saw a screening of Sleepaway Camp, which is an incredible slasher movie. And there's a twist in the movie that I don't want to give away, because if you haven't seen it, it's totally amazing. but it has to do with like sexual identity and gender identity. And like Felissa Rose, the lead actress, was talking about how that movie came out in the 80s, that like people were all kind of off put by it. There were some people who, you know, now the filmmakers were afraid that they would view it as like transphobic or something wrong, but they said the most interesting thing is how the trans community has really like embraced that film and, you know, kind of come together with it and championed it as this thing for them, and how it's really brought together a lot of people in the community. And I think it's so cool that a genre like this has just spent so many years building each other up and providing this safe community for people who feel like they don't belong. And I've always been someone who I felt like I haven't really belonged. It's difficult when you have such niche interests and it's like people look at you like you're weird. And so horror is something I really love and appreciate. And I know Ray and I probably could spend this entire episode just talking about why we love horror movies, but that is very simply why I love it, is the community behind it, the material. It's just amazing.
I think the only thing I will add to what you said too is, you touched on this earlier where you were saying that you can put these really traumatic and horrible experiences and manifest them in a fantastical way. You know, you look at a lot of these movies that have these really intense, dramatic moments, you know, that just give you the chills, but often it's transcending the blood and the gore. And I love how these directors tap into the human psychology. You know, I was watching a show the other day, and there's two things that really impressed me because I've always known about it, but I never have actually like thought about it, if that makes sense. One of them, they were talking about Nosferatu, and they were saying that one of the reasons why that movie was so horrifying is because the world was already on edge about moving pictures. A lot of people at the time were scared of the fact that moving pictures even existed, and then you put this horrifying person, you know, as Count Orlok, so that made like people are already on edge about moving pictures, and now you have in the moving picture one of the most horrifying creatures doing a phenomenal performance. And then on the other side you have they were talking about the movie of Lucio Fulci's Zombie 2, and they talk about that iconic scene where the girl gets poked and like gets basically stabbed in the eyeball, and they were saying it's like the reason why that scene is so powerful is not because it's this bloody gory thing, it's because it's relatable. When we see a zombie bite someone's neck, we don't know what that's like. We're never going to know what that's like. But we've been poked in the eye. So when we see that on the screen, it's just so gut-wrenching because we have an idea of what that could potentially feel like. So I just love when it comes to horror, how these directors tap into like very fascinating psychological thought processes that we have. And then they put it on the screen and it just like haunts us in the best way possible. And I also feel like horror makes us face our fears from a safe place. I can watch a horror movie from the safety of my couch, and I can probably have a really, like, for example, The Babadook is a great example of like the grief, when we deal with grief and when we deal with mental illness. And I deal with that stuff myself. So when I watch a movie like The Babadook, I am forced to face the fear of grief and depression, but from the safety of my couch and with a screen in front of me. So I feel like horror is very effective at helping us face our demons from a safe place.
100%. I think that's a really great way to sum it all up together, is the ability to face your fear from a safe environment. And I mean, and you know, people in the horror community, I love watching stories where people are like, I used to be so scared of that, and now I love sitting down and watching them, and then they gravitate out of that even more to go like to haunted houses and stuff to try to face their fears even more. And that really is a cool way to put it, and I think that perfectly sums it up. And I think this conversation transitions really well into our topic today, which we're talking about A24 horror films. And I think this kind of ties into a conversation that Ray and I have had before on the podcast, which is like, what does horror mean to different people and what is horror? Because I think it'll be really interesting when we talk about horror in the A24's catalog, especially because I feel like A24 doesn't really specialize in what the general populace would call traditional horror. everything in A24's catalog is very like nuanced art house horror. There's a couple movies that I feel like fall into a more standard-esque definition as to what horror is, but I'll be really curious about movies that you pick today, Ray, to talk about, as well as ones that I pick, because there are elements in some of these films that I feel like are horrific that, you know, some people might not say, oh, that's a horror movie, but there definitely are horror elements and horror themes that exist in those films.
So what are some of those movies? Like, I don't know, let's just kick it off. I know that, like you said, A24 has a way of looking at horror through really interesting lenses. Like, when you watch an A24 movie, I feel like you're not just going to watch as much as I love these movies, you're not going to watch a Friday the 13th. You're not going to watch, one of those. You're going to watch something that's maybe a little bit darker and more sinister and probably leaves you in a depressive probably state. Like, and I'll just kick things off. Like, my all-time favorite movie from A24 and my all-time favorite horror movie from A24, not in general, but from A24, is The Witch. I know we always nerd out about Eggers, and today is no exception. I love The Witch. I feel like The Witch changed horror for me. It changed what horror could mean. It changed how horror could be portrayed. It kind of demystified the whole, like, horror is this gory, sexualized and extremely grotesque thing, and it kind of, I mean, there is blood and there is sexuality and there's all that in The Witch, but it's done in a way that it's not glorified. It's legitimately frightening.
Well, I think it's almost, and what you said is interesting, and I'm curious if you feel the same way. It feels almost like a return to form to like classic 70s horror, where it's like less about, hey, how much can we jump things in front of your face and scare you immediately, to like building tension. Because I think it's funny, like when I was growing up as a kid, my parents would say things like, oh, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is like the most violent, brutal, disgusting movie that's ever existed, or oh, Halloween's disgusting, or Alien. But when you go back now and you watch those movies, the reason why they're so scary is because they're so nuanced and they're all about storytelling and building up the suspense and not necessarily like showing you the threat right away. And one of the things about The Witch is, yes, very early on in the film, we get this horrible scene of this baby being taken away and literally sacrificed at the beginning of the film. But what it makes the movie so scary is that feeling of isolation that you get, and how Robert Eggers spends so much of the runtime building up this familial dynamic to where you're seeing kind of the double crossing from these two little kids kind of pitting against Anya Taylor-Joy's character, and then like the father siding with her normally, where the mother seems to be more like kind of at her throat about things, and just watching these people tear each other apart internally. It's so much more about that storytelling element, which I think is very predominant in 1970s horror. I mean, you look at like The Exorcist, which is considered the pinnacle of all horror films, and that movie, yes, it has scary elements in it, but it's all about building that tension. And I think Robert Eggers does that so excellently in The Witch, where it's just like between the sound design, the score, and the performances, you're just kind of like immersed into this world where I love seeing people's reactions the first time they watch it, because you really have no idea where it's going to go.
I would challenge anybody to play this like really cheap jump scare versus that scene where Thomason is playing peekaboo with the baby and she goes to do the third peekaboo and then the baby's gone. The dread and just horror of that scene, and it's silent. It's not a jump scare. She just does the peekaboo and then the baby's gone, and then it's just silence. And I would argue that scene has more horror and dread in that moment of silence than any jump scare I've ever seen.
Well, exactly. And I think that, jump scares, it's less about the imagery on screen scaring you and more just about anyone is going to be startled by a loud noise. Like human beings, like that's the way your body has fight or flight. So like if you hear an immensely loud noise, your body's immediate response is to jump or to be terrified. But the thing is, everyone has been in a situation where they've held a baby, they've had a child, they've had a pet, they've had something that they've taken care of that they love so much, and you see the innocence and the beauty of a child who like can't even make decisions for themselves. They're literally relying reliant on someone else to take care of them, and that being taken away from you when it is your responsibility and you not knowing what is going to happen next. I agree with you, Ray. It is one of the most horrifying things, and what I love is Eggers at the beginning of The Witch, everything is so nuanced and it's very like subtle. It's not like super disturbing right out of the gate, but some of the imagery in the third act of this movie and just how violent it gets, it's like the restraint of Eggers holding off until the very end of the movie to really kind of give you those gut punch, brutal, violent moments. It makes the payoff even better because he's had that restraint for the first hour and 10 minutes of the film.
I feel like that is the beauty of like this, and I hate the term elevated horror, but that seems the way that a lot of people are talking and discussing it. But the fact that it's not elevated horror, it's just good storytelling. All horror is great. Just some horror rely on other aspects of things, but this one is one of those that relies on storytelling, and I feel like that's where a lot of these horror films excel at, is storytelling, because, you know, at the end of the day, the reason why The Witch for me was so frightening by the end is because, you know, the ending happens and you see what happens at the ending, but throughout the first hour and 20 minutes, I've been rooting for Thomasin. I've been wanting her to like succeed and to win, basically. So that ending is so it's kind of like it leaves this dread on you, because, you know, I know a lot of people kind of reject the whole religious upbringings. They look at these situations and they're like, oh yeah, she's breaking free of the bonds of religion, which, I mean, to some people that's great, but at the same time, I am one of those that I don't believe, if religion isn't your thing, which is totally fine, I don't particularly understand, and maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't understand how switching to the overzealousness of satanic darkness is any better, if that makes sense, you know?
I think for me, the end of that movie is less about giving yourself over to the quote-unquote evils of Satan or whatever. I would say that I feel like the end of that movie is her father was so indoctrined into this belief system that you watch the clash between his own personal beliefs and the beliefs of the place that they were living. And he was to the point where he thought the way that they were teaching religion isn't the same way that he was teaching religion, which is why there was this separation. And then I think Eggers is saying something about like how religious extremism can cause, you know, separation in families and cause a lot of destruction. But I think less of like the giving yourself over to Satan or something at the end, that it's much more of just like the freedom of escape from that control. And from the fact that, like, you know, in that time period alone, women weren't even viewed as anything. And so, like, no matter what Thomasin's opinion would have been about the situation, her family was never going to believe her. What you notice is at the end, all of those characters around that campfire are women. And they're all naked, which they're in their most vulnerable place. And I think that that's an important thing to look at too, is just like the, not only the freedom from like conservatism and like, you know, being controlled by this thing that people are indoctrined to believe from the beginning, but also the freedom of from patriarchy and from women finally being able to express themselves. And sure, there you can look at it through a negative perspective too, if you'd like, because typically when you see it in film, like pacts made with the devil, normally it doesn't end well for people. But so I think the cool part about it is there's enough of an ambiguity to it where it's similar to the end of Ari Aster's Midsummer, when you see Florence Pugh's expression at the end, but we all know like she's essentially given herself over to a cult. And despite them making themselves seem like a family, there will be a point if she stays with this cult that she'll have to make a decision on, does she want to jump off that cliff and die? Because it's the only way that you can stay with them once you get to a certain age. The thing about a lot of these A24 films is it leaves you that ambiguous ending to where it's not, it doesn't seem to me that it's like a, hey, you have to think this way, like this is the way that it is. It's more of like, hey, here's like 3 different avenues that you could see this as, and you as the viewer get to choose that. And that's what I love about The Witch, is I feel like it conveys so many of those different tones, and it really does leave you feeling unsettled at the end.
Yeah, that is true. And then you do get that sense of freedom for her and for all these women, especially like you said in that Puritan era. But that's actually a good point to look at it through that lens of like liberating yourself and how extremism can tear apart a family, which we obviously see in this film. So, but yeah, The Witch has always been, and I think still to this day remains as my favorite A24 movie. And one of my favorite horror movies just overall. But like, what is another one for you that kind of speaks like that to you?
Yeah, and I want to say before it's done, I think The Witch is just one of the greatest movies ever made. Period. I agree with you. I think that it redefined horror. I think that it really kind of sent this direction of like, because once The Witch was released, you see all these films that are trying to do the same thing, and a lot of them are very successful. But I want to start actually by talking about something that kind of challenges this perspective of like what is horror, what can horror be. And I want to talk about Alex Garland's Ex Machina, because this is a film that on the surface that a lot of people might see it and be like, oh, that might not necessarily be a horror movie, but I will argue it to the end of the day that this is a horror film in virtually every way. And I think that it's not even just a horror film in the sense of like the third act blow up and what occurs and what this movie brings to conversation about artificial intelligence, and like, is there a period where artificial intelligence becomes smart enough that you know it should be treated more as like a human being, but also Oscar Isaac's manipulation of these artificial intelligence robots, like, was he using them for sex? He views himself as like a god. Like, there's all of these really incredibly intellectual things put forth, and what I love is that Ex Machina starts, it's guised as this like science fiction, like, okay, we have this character who's going to meet his incredibly narcissistic and egotistical boss who is like literally sees himself as a deity and is like, hey, we're going to run this experiment to see if this robot is capable of being perceived as a person. Like, could you put this robot in the wild, and would people believe that it's a human being if she had a wig on and looked a certain way? And what I love is the way Ava is portrayed, because at first we as the audience members are looking at her through this lens of like, we feel incredible sympathy for her character. But we get to a point where we have to start asking ourselves, has she just been manipulating Domhnall Gleeson's character the entire film to get what she wants? And that, to me, is more horrifying than anything in a slasher movie.
Which is interestingly enough, her manipulation of Domhnall Gleeson is no different than the manipulation of Oscar Isaac towards Domhnall Gleeson as well. And there's something to be said, like, this film has a lot of callbacks too to classic horror, like, you know, obviously Dr. Frankenstein and the obsession he had with creating life, something that ultimately he wasn't able to control. Also, like, just abstract callbacks to the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you know, like, can these things that look and talk and sound like us walk among us? And what does that entail? What does that mean for our safety as a humanity? And we see through Ava that she is very dangerous. And she is very calculating, and everything she's doing, like, it's being done for a purpose. So, and this is in a situation where Domhnall Gleeson knows he's an experiment. So if you can imagine the type of things she can accomplish in a world where people believe that she is a human being. The frightening fact of the aftermath that can come for that.
There's so much subtlety in how horrifying this movie is. Because, Ray, I want to bring up a scene in particular. I feel like not enough films have really incredible setup and payoff. And I remember really early in the film, because I've rewatched this really recently, so it's very fresh in my memory. But when Domhnall Gleeson is in his room that one night, and there's the short in the system, and he tries to get out of his room, and he realizes that the card doesn't work, and he just like literally starts to have a panic, because he's like, how the hell am I supposed to even get out of here? And that pays off later when you realize that, like, yeah, you're kind of trapped down in here. That's early on in the film, to where it's kind of putting it in the back of your head, what all horrible things could take place while he's in here. Because Oscar Isaac's character, he starts off as really inviting, and he's seemingly like funny. He like seems like he wants to be buddy. But as the film progresses, you start to question even more, like, what is he capable of? And so on top of this artificial intelligence being in this essentially bunker that if the electricity fails, you're trapped and you are literally in the middle of nowhere where you can't even use the phone with the key card that you have because he's denied access for you to be able to make outgoing calls. There's so many things with you as a viewer where if you put yourself in Domhnall Gleeson's shoes, you just like, there's that dread throughout the entire movie. And I still on like this was like my fourth or fifth rewatch when I watched it this last time. It still unsettles me just as much as the first time I watched it.
Something that I think shouldn't go unmentioned is the set design. I mean,
oh, it's gorgeous.
It's gorgeous, but at the same time, the underground tunnel, like not tunnels, but like the hallways where Domhnall Gleeson is sleeping and where all the experiments are being performed, those very darkly like lit white hallways, they're so reminiscent of a horror movie, like of a horror movie set, to see those long, creepy, just completely empty hallways. And the fact that it's just
with the faces, the robot faces on the walls, like the different, because that always creeped me out too, is there's sections on those long hallways where they have like the facial cutouts from the different trials that he's done that haven't succeeded that are just sitting there on the wall, and I feel like that added even more of a creepy element.
Well, I wonder, I don't know if this was done on purpose, but I wonder if that's supposed to represent, like, you know, when you see the trophy hunters hang the heads of the animals they kill, and coming from Oscar Isaac, who seems to be a very egotistical character, who's to say that that's not a way of him kind of establishing his dominance, except, you know, just like kind of how he has that other robot that he basically uses for, you know, sexual gratification.
Mm-hmm. And there's just so many layers in this movie of things that can just horrify you. And that's what I appreciate so much about Garland as a screenwriter, is his movies are never just one thing. There's always so much going on. And that's why I have always classified this movie as a horror film. And I will always classify it as a horror film. And I just think that this is one that a lot of people might be like, you don't know what you're talking about. This isn't a horror movie. But I truly believe that it is a horror movie.
Yeah, I feel like, again, A24 has so many of these movies that don't quite seem like a horror movie, but, you know, they absolutely are. I mean, one that immediately comes to mind is, I feel like if a lot of people, we talk about this one a lot, but I feel like The Lighthouse is another example of someone saying, it's like, this is just plain weird, even though it's an absolute horror movie. But I feel like the average audience will look at The Lighthouse and think to themselves, this is just bizarre. I don't even know what to call this. And I think that's why it fits horror so well.
Well, and I think, you know, you obviously know The Lighthouse is probably in my top 3 movies of all time, and probably my favorite A24 movie. The thing I love about it is, and I know you've mentioned this a few times, Ray, but this is very like Lovecraftian horror. And it does this thing where it's so much more about the psychology of these two characters and how they get inside each other's minds and just how they're able to tear each other apart. And there's something to me that's so much scarier about being isolated in a place. Like, I think about the Blair Witch Project. And, you know, there's a lot of people now who, like, they'll watch the Blair Witch Project and they'll say, oh my God, this movie isn't scary. There's nothing scary about it. It's just some people wandering around in the woods. But I think about 1999 when that movie was released. Cell phone technology virtually doesn't exist. You're in the middle of nowhere with literally a map. You're walking around in this wilderness that there's like nothing for miles, and you think there's something out there with you. There is nothing more horrifying to me than that. So when I watch The Lighthouse, I think about these two guys in this time period where there is no form of communication, where a boat is dropping you in the middle of nowhere on an island with some of the worst weather conditions that you could ever imagine. Willem Dafoe's character is acting super weird about the light up in this lighthouse, to where Robert Pattinson's character has to be like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? I've never really met him before this. What's going on in his head? And then this whole idea of like seeing this mermaid and how much of this is inside of his mind. And then Eggers being such a brilliant filmmaker, getting you to the point where, I don't know if this was the same for you, Ray. I got to the point where I was asking myself if they were the same character. I was like, did he manifest this guy inside of his brain? Because they have the same name. And you just get to a point where you're asking yourself all of these questions. And it's like, just like what we talked about with The Witch, it's Eggers does this thing with isolation. And in this time period where you strip all technology and everything else away, it's horrifying. And obviously there's comedic levity in this film, which I think adds to it even more, because for a minute you'll find yourself laughing at like the ridiculous of Willem Dafoe's character or something over the top, and seconds later you're horrified again. And that Mark Corvin score with the really loud like foghorn from the lighthouse constantly blaring in the background. I remember seeing this in the theater, and just like, it was like I've never felt more immersed in my life in a movie than when I watched this. Like, it just so unsettled me, and honestly, like, it is so brutal that like I don't know how people couldn't call this a horror movie.
Oh, absolutely. And we can keep going for a second, but I also kind of want to preface this that, if you don't mind, there's another one I want to bring up that would kind of tie up with that whole, feeling of just two isolated characters going crazy. But before we get to that, just I wanted to add a little bit on this one, that like the insanity that they go through, and like, because you might just look at it through the lens of like, I know that like the farting thing was played for laughs, and there's that great scene where Robert Pattinson is like punching the wall and he's like, "You damn farts," and he just, which I know it's,
or the fucking a steak line, which is wonderful.
So it's like, I know that a lot of that is played for laughs, but at the same time, it's like, if you were to put yourself in the shoes and you're with this weird dude that won't let you go to the light, to the actual light, that makes you do all this crappy jobs, that's farting all the time, I mean, I know people that have lost their crap on others for far less, so like, I know it's played for laughs, but at the same time, it's like, well, if it were me, I'd probably be just that annoyed and frustrated by it.
Yeah, and I think Eggers does a really great job of balancing those tones, because like, I mean, you watch a movie like this, it's about 2 hours long, and could you imagine being on the edge of your seat for 2 hours, like just sick to your stomach? Like, I mean, even Ari Aster, if you look at his movies, he does a good job of adding little comedic bits in, and I think because, we talked about it at the beginning of the episode, but like drawing from personal experience, and that a lot of these filmmakers are putting themselves into these movies, despite life getting really horrible sometimes and things blowing out of control. That doesn't take away from the fact that people try to use comedy as levity. And I think that that's brilliant to put into a horror movie.
And, to kind of, unless you have something else to add about The Lighthouse, I wanted to bring up another movie that I feel like puts us in the mindset of two people being isolated, and you just watch them go insane. And this one, it's far more modern, but, is referring to The Blackcoat's Daughter.
That is so funny, because I was literally just about to bring up The Blackcoat's Daughter, and I'm so glad that you brought that movie up, because I think that The Blackcoat's Daughter is one of the most underrated in A24's catalog. And I also feel like, as far as like, if you think of what people might see as a more like, I guess, straightforward horror film, this one would probably come across as that. But yeah, that idea of these two characters being trapped at like a school when everybody else has gone away for the holiday season, and like something sinister is afoot, which you can sort of try to piece together at the beginning that might be of an occult nature. But what I love about this movie is that you're constantly questioning what that is. And I thought the twist in the movie was brilliant.
It is brutal. It is unrelenting. At first, you just think you're just watching two separate stories.
Exactly.
And how do they connect? And then when you find out how they connect, it's just staggering and crushing, because the thing that crushes me so much about that, and it's kind of what you and I we kind of mentioned a little bit about on the Witch episode, that like when people make, when we watch movies that deal with making deals with the devil, like things don't tend to end in the greatest note. And I feel like this movie is not trying to preach anything. It's just showing you the dread and the realization that just might be all alone, and you're just watching this movie and you're watching the devotion that this girl has and how crushing the final moments of that movie is.
Oh my God, it's brutal. And I will say, I've been following Kiernan Shipka since she was a little girl on Mad Men, and I feel like her career trajectory, obviously doing this Sabrina show and kind of just blowing up, she gives a really incredible performance in this movie, because I feel like it takes a specific type of actress for you to kind of like question their intention. And I feel like she plays it so well, of like the entire movie you're trying to ask yourself, what is going on with this girl? And like, does she have ill intent? Am I overthinking it too much? And there's that really great nuance. And I also think Emma Roberts is really great in this too. I think they both really do a fantastic job of playing these characters straight, and I love the direction that the Emma Roberts plot takes. I would have never guessed that it would have gone that direction. And speaking of it being spooky season, Blackcoat's Daughter is directed by Osgood Perkins, who is the son of the great Anthony Perkins, who was in a little-known film everybody might have heard of called Psycho. This was literally the next movie I was going to mention, so you and I must be mentally linked somehow. But The Blackcoat's Daughter is one I feel like not enough people talk about, and I feel like that does hit a little bit more into the straightforward horror that A24 provides, where like I could see this being marketed to general audiences and then them getting mad because it's very subtle and nuanced. But it really does explore that idea of isolation and kind of just makes you feel ill throughout the entire runtime.
It's one of those films that like there was never a moment that it let up where I was like, oh, I had a bit of levity here. I have a little bit of hope, but no, it's just like beating you just over and over, and it's just unrelenting. And just seeing all of the things that transpired throughout the movie, and like you mentioned, the performance of all of them. I mean, Emma Roberts. Remind me the name of the girl again.
Kiernan Shipka, yeah.
Her and the other girl too, like the other young girl that's in the school with her. They're all great.
Yes, everyone is great in it.
And yeah, again, it's one of those films that you could look at it through this like straightforward horror thing, but then you play it to like a mainstream audience and they would just look at you like, what is this? What in the world is this? But I think it speaks volumes. I think it's interesting that they changed the name from February to Blackcoat's Daughter.
Yeah, I feel like Blackcoat's Daughter has much more of like a ring to it. Where I feel like that's probably, they wanted something that drew the audience in a little bit more.
Yeah, February is going to be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it's like people might think that that's like a romantic comedy around Valentine's Day. Yeah, that would be my assumption if you're like a film promoter.
Yeah, I can see that for sure.
But I want to segue into Ray, because you just watched it recently, and I think it's cool to talk about. I think an underrated horror gem that not enough people talk about with A24, and I feel like a lot of people gave it crap, but you appreciate it as much as me, is Saint Maud. And I think Saint Maud is probably one of the scariest films that A24 has released in quite some time.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's funny because it's a fairly short movie, but I feel like they are able to do and say so much in, an hour and 20 minutes. It's ridiculous.
And I think what's interesting too is, like, obviously Ray and I have discussed this multiple times on the podcast before about this idea of like faith, and like, obviously, I'm not someone who practices faith anymore. Ray still has some form of a belief system, which whatever you choose to do in your life, whatever brings you comfort, like, is fine. But what I always find interesting in filmmaking, and I'm sure, Ray, even with your background, you'll still find this interesting, is that a lot of people generally, when they think about like faith or religion as a whole, there's like this comforting element to it, even if it's like something people don't practice. And I always think that when a filmmaker can take religion and paint it in a way that is so like horrifying and disturbing, where most people typically find comfort in it, there's just something so impressive to me about being able to just like flip the script and take something that people view normally as this like comfort or this ability to, find solace, and turn it into something so horrifying. Like, early on in this film, I feel like even the first shots in Saint Maud, when we're in the hospital and we don't really know what's going on really early, it just immediately draws you into like, okay, there's going to be some messed up stuff that is going to happen in this movie. And what I love about it too is that when our lead character goes to take care of this woman, they start to hit it off. And that, like, you can tell that this older woman seems to genuinely, like, be concerned with Maud's character and, like, wants her to be okay, even to the point where she's like, hey, it's not a problem to have God in your life and to want religion, but, like, you need to, like, live your own life. And I think this whole idea of, like, ingrained homophobia that comes up in the movie is really fascinating too. Like, and I thought that the way Rose Glass told this story, that none of it was ham-fisted. It was very nuanced, and, like, the way that everything came up in the story. And I think it really does go to show that, like, this is so much less of a story about a person who's, like, seeking faith as, like, a comfort, and someone who is literally just being controlled by these ideas that are being forced on them. And I think there's a really great divide in that idea. The fact that it's that on top of just being, like, even if you didn't pull any of that from watching this movie, it just genuinely has a disturbing atmosphere, an incredible score, and it will leave you on the edge of your seat until the very end of the movie.
I've always been of a certain belief that, and I hold on dearly to this, I believe that if you are someone who believes in, let's use the phrase a loving God. I feel like a lot of people that kind of connect with a religion, they believe in a God that's all loving. I know not everyone feels that way, but, like, I think the mainstream belief among Christianity is that we believe in a loving God that cares and loves for us. So I am one of those people that believes that if this God is so loving, then he or she, however you choose to see that, they believe in actual happiness and accepting others and caring for others. And they also believe that if you believe that you were created by a deity, that you were created for who you are, not to be this, like, carbon copy clone of some faction, but you're actually, like, your own individual person with feelings and emotions. And I feel like in Saint Maud has gone through the extreme of, I am nothing and my whole personality revolves around this belief, and if I just stray even just a little bit from that belief, then I am this horrible person, which is antithetical to what scripture teaches about an all-loving savior and God, if you want to look at it through that lens. So I think that's even critical, even if you are someone who identifies as a believer, and I've never understood this about this whole new wave of conservative Christianity, where they believe in this, like, punishing and authoritarian God, where it's like, no, if you believe in the God of the Bible that supposedly loves and cares for everybody, then the God you're preaching is antithetical to that.
Well, I find this interesting too, Ray, and, obviously I've grew up in church and I'm very familiar with the Bible. I've read it multiple times, but when you look at things through a biblical lens, the Bible says that God has given you the ability of free will. And I feel like this movie really kind of explores this idea of this person doesn't have that free will. They are literally indoctrined, but especially the interesting twist, Ray, is they're indoctrined by a thing that they think is God that really is not. And I think that is what's the most fascinating part of the movie too, is this thing that they think they've been listening to and providing servitude to is not God. And this idea of, like, people can be taken advantage of and manipulated to believe something that isn't necessarily what they believe. I mean, I look at it at a core, my youngest brother, who he's no longer practicing religion either. He actually went to Bible college for a few years, and he said what the funniest part about going to Bible college was when they would teach the section in the Old Testament that all these churches and political figures use to try to preach against homosexuality, that was put in the Bible in Aramaic, talking about men in that time period who were raping little boys, and that had nothing to do with homosexuality. It was literally put in the Bible to discourage men from having sex with children. And so the Bible now is being misinterpreted because obviously we're taking for granted the idea that this book was written in a language that is not English, and it's being translated by people and misused out of the context of the way that it was originally written. And I think that context is everything, and I think when you look at religion as a whole, especially Christianity, it's something that is portrayed as like this loving, accepting thing, which like in theory it should be. This movie really explores the idea of like the people who take that and use it to be hateful and bigoted, and there's two sides to every story, and I think Rose Glass portrays this incredibly to where it can leave even a person who might have a more faith-driven background to kind of look and think more deeply about how people perceive religion. And I don't even think necessarily that it's like completely demonizing in a way that like people would go, oh, this is blasphemous and horrible. I think it's thought-provoking, and I think thought-provoking movies like this should exist.
Well, the way I see it too is that like if you are a person of religious belief, like you said, you're supposed to. My family, my parents always said this thing. I actually abide by this. I do believe in this. My dad was like would always tell me, it's like, hey, God gave you a brain, use it. And I feel like these type of films, you can, play it for someone and they will look at it through that lens of like, this is blasphemous, this is awful, I don't want to watch this. But I feel like art is meant to be challenging. If art wasn't challenging, then what's the point of it? And I feel like these types of movies, I don't think they're designed to demonize religion or to tell people, you need to walk away from religion. It's meant to kind of, put a mirror up to believers and be like, are you going to be this person, or are you going to be better than that? Are you going to be this loving person you claim to be, or are you going to be this bigoted human that is not accepting of others because they're different? And I feel like a lot of these type of movies are putting a mirror up to society and be like, we're not saying this is everyone. We're just saying you should strive to not be this person.
I love Saint Maud. Ray loves Saint Maud. It's such a good movie. I'm excited to hear what movie you want to talk about next.
I feel like another one that not a lot of people talk about as far as horror, and this one is a more straightforward horror movie, but I also feel like this movie does what a lot of horror movies do that I hate, but this one for some reason is endearing. It's the looking at a group of people making terrible choices and dumb choices. And I'm talking about the group of people in Green Room.
Yes.
You look at the film Green Room and you think to yourself, these kids are stupid. They're dumb. They're making the stupidest choices that they could think of. But then you try to put yourself in those shoes and I'm like, would I make a smarter choice? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think that movie really puts into question too, like this whole idea of like adrenaline and like how, it's funny. I listen to a lot of like true crime podcasts that talk about like people that are put into situations where they're confronted by like an assailant or by a killer, and they're like, oh my God, why would they ever make this decision? This is so stupid. But you look at it in hindsight and it's like when fight or flight kicks in, you don't know what the hell you would do in any moment, even if you're like the most intelligent person on the planet. And so I think this movie really looks at that through a very unique lens. And this movie does not hold back from the violence at all. This movie is brutal. But I also really love the way that it combines genuinely suspenseful horror with the music culture. Because I've been to some pretty dingy venues in my life. I've never been to a neo-Nazi bar. But I've been to some pretty dingy concert venues in my life. And this movie just kind of like bleeds gross. Like from the moment they get into that concert venue, you just kind of feel disgusting.
Yeah, I know. There's just something slimy about it. I know that I've seen this meme going around about what is up, Denny's, the hardcore band playing at Denny's, but like you actually see that moment in this movie where they're playing at some like Mexican restaurant for like 4 people.
I love it so much. It's great. It's someone. So Jeremy Saulnier, who directed this film, he's someone who I've followed for a while now, and I really like him a lot. His film prior to this was called Blue Ruin, and
Blue Ruin is great. Yeah, Blue Ruin is great.
Blue Ruin is a revenge film that makes sense. Blue Ruin is like a guy who is going after these people who murdered members of his family, and he's sloppy. He makes mistakes because he's never... That's something... Does that irritate you in movies, Ray, when someone goes to take revenge and they're like immediately the most expert person with a weapon? I loved that, like, in that movie when he fired off the shotgun and stuff, like, he was literally like thrown back at one point because he had no idea what the hell he was doing.
Well, and then you look at these kids in Green Room as well. It's the same thing. It's like, have you ever gone to a show and met like these druggy punk kids that are super analytical and know how to take down a crime organization? Like, no.
Also, you take a person who we all know and love so much throughout our lives, Mr. Patrick Stewart, and you turn him into one of the most evil villains in any movie.
Hearing Patrick Stewart say the N-word kind of ruined me. Just saying.
Yeah, same here. Sorry, Picard. It ruined me too, but I will say he played maniacal very well. Also, this movie has one of my biggest crushes, Imogen Poots, who is incredible in this movie. I like her in pretty much everything that she's in. And then R.I.P. Anton Yelchin gives an amazing performance in this movie.
There was that moment. There's one of my favorite scenes in this movie. It's a very subtle scene. I thought the scene was just beautiful. I'm just bringing it up because I thought it was a beautiful scene when so they play Nazi punks in the venue.
Yes.
And then everyone's pissed at them. But then they start playing their next song, but then they cut out the sound, and it's just this beautiful soaring score in this mosh pit going on at the same time. And there's something about that scene that gives me the chills. Yes.
I love it because it's being a music lover. You watch that and you realize, like, yeah, you've experienced that before, being in a room with people and just living through the music, and the idea that they pulled out the actual music that was going on stage to substitute for that score was fantastic.
As music lovers, I feel like this film hits on another level for anyone that loves music, because to a lot of us, a concert venue is a place of safety. It's a place where we go with like-minded people to hang out, enjoy music. And, you hear all these like talking points from bands. I remember seeing bands like Refuse that would get up and preach about how like we're all equal and we all should love each other and love one another. Even get very political. And so you go to these concert venues thinking to yourself like, this is my people. This is where I belong. This is where I feel safe. And for them to grab the sanctity of a concert venue where all of us weirdos go enjoy weird music and turn it into this dangerous and just slimy thing happening just hits on another level for me.
Yes, 100%. And I want to say, too, before we quit talking about this movie, that still one of the scenes that scares me more than anything in the world, especially me being, like Ray, a huge animal lover, those dogs are horrifying.
Oh, my God.
Yes, like that was the first time in my life I was like, God, I'd be scared to go up and try to pet those dogs.
I will say that scene when at the very end where you see the dog just kind of wandering back to its owner who now is dead and he's just looking for him was just so crushing.
So, Ray, the next movie I want to talk about is a movie that actually kind of changed my perspective as to... We've had this conversation before, and I really thought that this was good about the idea of what horror is and how horror isn't necessarily... like spooky ghosts, skeletons, zombies, whatever, that horror can be reality. And this is a movie that really changed my perception on what horror can be. And that's the 2015 Brie Larson film Room.
Oh my gosh.
This movie like redefined the idea of what horror is, because I know most people on the surface would probably classify this film as a drama, but this movie horrified me. I don't think I've ever been more sick watching a movie in my life than watching this movie. And if you guys have not seen this movie, this is actually based off of a true story that unfortunately happened in the state of Ohio, which bums me out. But it's about a young woman and her son who get kidnapped and locked in this room. She's trying to literally raise her son, who has never seen the outside world ever. And the guy who has them kidnapped is like just a complete and total psychopath. Like, the interactions that they have together, I don't know if you feel the same way, Ray, but anytime he'd enter the room, I would start to shake because I had no idea what he was going to do. And the thing about this movie that is so fascinating is, like, you get the period of time that they're in this room. And it's absolutely horrifying because you never know. They call this guy Old Nick. You never really know what he's going to do. You have no idea. And at one point during the movie, they finally get out. And I think the horror is almost more when they're out dealing with the post-traumatic stress of being in that place. And this movie is a horror movie to me because real life sometimes can be horror. And the fact that there are people in this world who actually realistically went through this and dealt with this horrible thing, and that this poor young kid and his mother had to go through this horrible situation. That scene towards the end of the movie where they go back to see it again, I was like a ball of tears at the end of this. Like, I could not imagine what it would be like emotionally to go through this level of trauma. And it just really is a horrifying movie that also is beautiful about a relationship between a son and her mother. And I don't know how many people would want to, like, argue with me at the fact that this is a horror movie, but this is one of the most horrifying things I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, I feel like there is... I think a lot of people watch movies like this and they think it's a drama, but I feel like the horror of, because we talked about this earlier, horror disguises true events, true situations in a very fantastical way. And I feel like if we could tear off the fantastical mask of horror, this is what the underneath of that horror movie looks like. A lot of horror movies are built with, I guess you might say that Room, very representational of the engine that keeps horror going. Taking really traumatic and just brutal stories like this. And obviously they will add a serial killer, they will add a monster, a zombie, but in this situation, it's stripped of all the monsters and it just gives you the heart and the engine of horror, which is being stuck in a situation like this. Because to me, this is more horrifying than a zombie chasing me. A zombie's not going to come back from the dead and kill me, but I could get kidnapped. That's not out of the realm of possibilities. And that's what I was talking about earlier, where I said that on Lucio Fulci's zombie movie, where that woman gets her eye stabbed, that what makes that moment so impactful is because we all know what it's like to get poked in the eye. We all know what it's like to be in that situation of danger. So seeing an eye getting poked is more gutting than a zombie eating someone's neck, because we don't know what that's like. The same thing with Room. A vampire coming into my window and seducing me and biting me in the neck is not that likely to happen, but I could step out my front door today and something could happen to me just on my way to my doctor's appointment. So like, that is more horrifying in my opinion.
This movie, like, it's heartbreaking, and I feel like she really does an amazing job at playing that concerned mother who also deals with the traumatic events of the aftermath of this. And Jacob Tremblay does an amazing job as the young kid. I think that, like, just the true real emotions that you feel through a child's eyes from this situation, like, it just, like, thinking about it now, it sends chills down my spine. It's horrifying. It really upset me. And yeah, this is a horror movie. I don't care what anyone says. Between
this, Dr. Sleep, and Wonder, I'm convinced Jacob Tremblay is like the future, like Leonardo DiCaprio or Robert De Niro or something like that.
He's an incredible child actor. I honestly, that scene in Dr. Sleep, you just mentioned that, and like my body started to shake. Like, oh God, that Mr. Mike Flanagan, why did you do that to us?
It's funny because on a random tangent, he said that's about a quarter of what they shot.
Oh, Jesus Christ, I don't even want to think about that.
Yeah, and this is the last one I want to bring up. Again, one of those that I feel like people would argue that it's not a horror movie, but I would say it is. And this was the American debut for Mr. Denis Villeneuve, and I'm talking about Enemy.
I love Enemy. Oh my God. Yeah, Enemy is a horror movie. I don't care what anybody says, because the thing is, at the end of the day, if you get off work and you go home and you watch a DVD and you see a motherfucker in a movie that looks exactly like you, and you're like, oh my God, he lives literally down the road from me, you would be a little off-put. I think you'd be a little scared. Yeah.
Oh, 1,000%. Especially when that guy turns out to be a psychopath in return.
Yeah. Now, I will say, and this is a little bit spoilery, So I'm going to give a little spoiler warning here, but Ray, I want to have this conversation with you really quickly. I've seen Enemy, I think 4 times now after the last time I watched it. I don't think they're different characters.
You think it's the same guy?
I think it's the same guy. I thought that after I finished it this time, because I didn't see it the first couple of times I watched it, but he goes to that guy's apartment and the other Jake Gyllenhaal's apartment, and when he's going through his boxes of stuff, he finds that ripped photo that he had in his own house of him with his girlfriend, and it's in his apartment. So they have the same photos.
Do you think there's like a number 23 situation where it's just the life he doesn't remember?
I think that it's that the life with that other girl, because you notice whenever he goes to that apartment, the apartment that he lives at when he's not at school, it's very minimalistic. There's virtually nothing in it. There's like no decorations. There's nothing. I think he has split personality disorders, and that he doesn't realize when he goes into that persona as the actor.
That makes sense.
And that he was living dual lives with both of those people. Because you think like when he's at that apartment and she leaves, like there's that whole idea of like an unreliable narrator. How much of him being in that place by himself is even real? And that because that girl never spends the night with him when she's home. She always leaves. I noticed that at the beginning of the film. And then like a lot of people wanted to shit on the whole thing about the spider at the end, but that is
horrifying.
Like, if you pay attention, but also if you pay attention, the very first shot at the beginning of the film is Jake Gyllenhaal's character is at that bar with all those men watching that naked woman dance. And at the very beginning of the movie,
there's a spider.
There's a spider that they take off, and what do you notice? The men all throw money on the table, and the woman goes to step on the spider, because they're paying her to crush it with her high heels. And that is Denis Villeneuve's statement on toxic masculinity and how men treat women and how men are in general. And what happens with the spider at the end of the movie when Jake Gyllenhaal comes into the room? Cowers to the back of the room. Because the woman is afraid, because Jake Gyllenhaal has once again taken on his toxic, disgusting persona as that actor man.
Oh, I love that movie so much.
Yeah, and also, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but Richard Ayoade, who's someone I love very much, did a movie that's exactly like Enemy. It's called The Double with Jesse Eisenberg and Mia Wasikowska, and it's also very good. You should 100% watch that.
I do want to watch that, actually, The Double.
It's based on the same book that Enemy was based on. But no, I do think that this movie is horrifying. I think that it's really... Something about it that really kind of grosses me out a little bit is the absolutely disgusting color palette of the movie.
Yes.
That looks almost like baby poop. And it just makes you feel disgusting while you watch it. And also the score to that movie is beautiful. Kind of disappointed I don't own a vinyl copy of that. I love Enemy. I feel like this was early Denis Villeneuve, and this was really him showing just how capable he was as a filmmaker. But it's a really great psychological thriller that balances horror really well. And I think what's so good about it is Jake Gyllenhaal's character at the beginning of the film's constantly looking over his shoulder. He never knows what's going to happen next, and that kind of puts you in his shoes as well to make you feel really uncomfortable.
The paranoia that this movie built is textbook horror for sure.
And there's one more film that I want to mention before we wrap up this discussion, and this does not have to be a long discussion because Ray and I have already talked about it in detail, but because it is so recent and it really excites me, is I really hope that with the popularity of Ty West X and now Pearl, that we can see that A24 is kind of dipping their toes into a more conventional idea of like a slasher film or like horror, and I would love to see them give more money to stuff like that, because I still have not seen Pearl, but X is like the most fun I've had at a movie theater in a very long time.
You know what? I am not interested in Pearl. Just seeing those scenes with the farm animals, I'm like, I don't think I can stomach this one.
It's funny because there's a lot of people who I follow on Letterboxd and Twitter who have actually said that it is better than X, and that it pulls away a lot from like Wizard of Oz and a lot of classic cinema.
I've heard that as well. My qualm comes from the trailer shows her like abusing so many farm animals that I'm just not sure I can stomach it.
Oh, now I will say though, when we're talking about X, one of my favorite slasher scenes of all time, I've submitted it now, is when that guy sticks his head up to the peephole in the barn door and she sticks the pitchfork through it. I love that so much. And I think X just really bled that love for 1970s horror films. But it also still had that really nuanced thing. And I don't know if you know, but they announced Maxine, which I cannot wait to see where Mia Goth's character goes after the end of X. I think that's going to be very exciting. So I loved X. I know Ray loved X too. I thought we needed to mention it. I can't believe we made it that whole discussion without talking about Hereditary. Hereditary is a good movie. We'll just say it really quick. We love those movies too, guys. If in case any of you are out there, I know a couple of our followers on Instagram have said some stuff before about you and Ray didn't talk about Hereditary or Midsummer. So we'll just say it really quick. We love Hereditary and Midsummer. Ray, will you accent that, make our viewers feel better?
Sure. Nosotros amamos Hereditario and Midsommar. Here, see, I even said it in Spanish.
Muchas gracias, amigo. Honestly, I love those movies, but it's what Ray said. I really wanted to talk about like Black Coat's Daughter and Room and a lot of these films that I feel like don't get the love that they deserve. And Ray, I really like this format. I'm curious as to what our viewers think. So if you guys leave us some comments or let us know. Between this episode and the director's episode, I really like this casual format where we can have more of a discussion and just kind of loosely mention things. It feels a lot more fun, and I feel like the discussion's more casual. So you guys let us know. Do you like the list format more? Do you like the casual things? Because Ray and I obviously do this because we want to do it and we have fun doing it together, but we'd also want to know what you guys like.
Yeah, 1000%. Hit us up. We love to hear your thoughts on all of this, and we're excited to continue as October is about to begin. By the time this episode airs, we will be just a few days away from the most wonderful time of the year. But I would be remiss if before we left, I didn't ask Nate, what are one or two things you checked out this?
Oh, Ray, I have been waiting for this conversation, sir, because I watched I Saw the Devil.
Yes!
And on your recommendation, and not only is I Saw the Devil probably the best crime movie I've ever watched, but it is one of my new favorite movies, and it is currently sitting at number 1 on my Letterboxd top 4 right now. Oh, yeah, I loved this movie. It has been so long since I have watched a 2-hour and 20-minute movie that, I didn't look away once. I was so enamored by the performances in this movie. It is one of the most brutal, unrelenting, disturbing, but also, fascinating commentaries on revenge that I have ever watched in my life. And every performance in this, because I've seen Old Boy. The guy from Old Boy was the serial killer in this movie.
Oh, okay.
And I can't ever look at him the same way again, because he was probably the most evil character I've ever seen in a movie.
The cat and mouse game that he plays of this catch and release throughout the whole film. Oh, it's so messed up.
And the thing is, it's almost like he cares what's going to happen to the other people, but at the same time he doesn't, because he wouldn't let the guy go if he cares. I'm going to tell you right now, I have never in my life felt so sick than in that scene where he's in the hospital room with that nurse. I was clenching my fists, she better get the fuck out of here because this is his fault. And when that cop looked at him in the third act, and I don't want to talk about it specifically, but when he says, if anything happened to him, I'm going to kill you, I felt that so palpably. When he's talking about the police chief, oh my God. This movie, I think I texted Ray this. It feels like David Fincher's Zodiac, but more brutal.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can describe it. It's such an incredible movie when it comes to this idea of police procedurals backed up with someone who's not really following the rules. I also loved the incorporation of that cannibal couple.
Yeah.
I thought that was such a unique thing to do. And also, Ray, the fucking score to that movie, dude. It's one of the best scores I've heard in years.
Yeah, Korean filmmakers need to start releasing stuff on vinyl, because holy crap.
So like immediately, of course, I finished that movie and I'm like, I love the score to this movie so much. Where can I get it on vinyl? And it's by a group or a person named Maug, MOWG. Because I was listening to it after it was done. I was like, oh my God, I love this so much. And of course, it has never been pressed on vinyl. You can just get a CD copy. So if you're out there, Waxwork Records, Mondo, get a hold of this. By the way, I'll send you the link when the episode's done, Ray, because I messaged them literally a week before you recommended this. A t-shirt company I follow released these exclusive t-shirts for I Saw the Devil that are amazing, and they stopped the sale of them, and I messaged them personally and said, will you guys be restocking these? I just watched this movie and I need one. And they said, we're going to release more next week. And I was like, thank you so much. I'm going to send this to Ray because he's going to want to buy one. They're like the most like awesome long sleeve shirts that have incredible artwork from the movie. But yes, we could have probably done a whole episode on I Saw the Devil. So Ray, I appreciate you for recommending me that movie. That's going to be a new favorite for me. So what did you watch this week?
I'll keep it brief because I got to get going soon. But I watched two, and I'll just keep it kind of brief. One of them is a French-Canadian movie called Pontypool.
Oh, you found it. How was it?
I still need I'd like to rewatch it because I found like some low like res format, and the sound wasn't great, and and it has YouTube subtitles, which we all know those suck. So it was great though. It was one of those movies that takes entirely in like one area, one room. These people are broadcasting, the news to this small town, just like your typical sports and weather news. And then suddenly they hear news that this group is congregating around this doctor's office, and then the group is getting violent, and then they're starting to break through the windows, and essentially turns into a zombie film. But like 99%, like 90% of the movie is just them narrating what's happening. You don't actually see anything until like maybe an hour into the movie. The entire time is just them getting phone calls and reporting back in the news what's happening. So you just get these phone calls of people in distress, scared. You hear noises in the background. Meanwhile, he's just reporting back to on the radio station of what's happening. So like, it's really unique because most of the film is told from the recording booth of this radio station, and then eventually you get a reveal, and then you get a reveal of what's causing the actual outbreak, which I want to rewatch it because I didn't quite 100% get it, because there are moments that are in French, and the subtitles were really choppy, so I couldn't really make up too well at the end. So I'd like to rewatch it like with better definition and better sound quality, but it was really unique. It was really unique being able to see this film about zombies that's told almost entirely through a radio station, and you don't actually see any creatures until like the last 20 or 30 minutes of the film.
I love that so much. I'm definitely going to watch that movie.
And then the other one that I saw, it's called The Eyes of My Mother.
The Eyes of My Mother is amazing.
The movie is so disturbing.
So you know what's funny? I actually watched that the year it was released on Netflix. And I have not seen it since, but oh my God, the black and white cinematography is beautiful. And it left me on the edge of my seat until that very third act climax. And boy, is it brutal.
It's brutal. It is gut-wrenching. It is, it'll mess you up. And it was great. It also like the epitome of like art house horror.
100%. It's it definitely is, and it's only like an hour and 16-minute runtime, and every single second is utilized so perfectly. The director of that film, Nicholas Pesce, I think is his name, Pesce. He directed another film I watched with Christopher Abbott and Mia Wasikowska called Piercing, that I would highly recommend if you haven't seen. Very disturbing. And then for some reason he decided to give up his independent art house career to do the Grudge remake, which I don't understand that. I don't know what you were doing, bud, but you should have stuck to the things you were good at, which is independent art house horror.
Yeah, because The Eyes of a Mother was so cool. And then, like, one of those movies that the movie ended, and I got online and ordered this freaking vinyl.
Those are great picks, Ray. I honestly, like, I I haven't even thought about The Eyes of My Mother since I watched it, but I absolutely loved that movie when it first came out.
It's on HBO Max if you want to revisit it.
Oh, I think I actually might own a Blu-ray copy of it. I think I bought one right after it came out, but I'm similar to you. My physical media collection is huge. Sometimes things slip my mind. But yeah, that's what Ray and I have been watching this week. I would have said a second movie, but I dwelled on I Saw the Devil for a long time, so I won't hold people up any longer. So that's what we're watching. And so next week, we're going to kick off the spooky season, which Ray made a really big announcement last week, which I'm going to let him talk about a little bit after I'm done announcing what we're going to do. But we are going to start off by talking about slasher movies. We thought that would be a fun way to intro into the Halloween season. Ray and I are just going to bring up some slasher movies that we love, maybe give you guys some recommendations of ones you may not have heard of or ones that we think are really underrated. And I look forward to doing that. The spooky season is my favorite time of year. We really talked about it a lot at the beginning of the episode, and I can't wait for it. And what I also can't wait for is I'm getting everything set up to do my vinyl challenge that Ray has set up for us, and he's going to give you a little bit more info about it again and now.
Yeah, so I put together, I kind of switched the wording, and I'm just calling it a media challenge because I realized the other day as I'm going through all of these that we have some followers that are book collectors or just collect movies or maybe even just like memorabilia that they don't necessarily collect vinyl. And we want to make it inclusive for everyone to be able to participate. So I figured, I switched the wording on the challenge. Like instead of calling it a record, I called it like a body of work or a media item. Instead of calling it a band, I call it an artist. Because I want people to feel like, oh, you don't have a record? Cool. Share a book, share a CD, share a film. Maybe you have a cool, memorabilia from a film that you want to share, or so I just figured why not extend it to everybody along with a little giveaway of The Witch on the 180 gram vinyl and a Blu-ray copy of my all-time favorite movie, Night of the Living Dead, but from the Criterion edition that comes with all these cool stuff. And you can enter the giveaway on Instagram.
You guys are not familiar with the Criterion Collection. The Night of the Living Dead Criterion Blu-ray is beautiful. You'd be missing out if you don't try to win this thing because it is incredible.
So I'm giving those away. Oh well, I'm giving those away. All you have to do is follow us on our social media page on the Film Monsters podcast. Tag one of your friends in it. Let them know about the giveaway. And each prompt on the challenge, I've attached it to a movie quote. So if you can guess all 30 movie quotes and DM us on the Film Monster podcast, that'll get you another foot in the door for the giveaway for a bonus entry. We actually had someone reach out and guess all 30 of them correct, and that was pretty cool. I was excited to see that. So, just something fun. I know that I'm not doing like $1 million giveaway or something like that, but I just thought it'd be fun to get people excited. And hopefully, if you're not familiar with the Criterion, this is a good way to introduce you to it.
That is so cool. I love it so much. I think that it is going to really get people excited for the Halloween season. I'm excited to just participate, post some of my albums, and be involved in it. And I really look forward to seeing people participate, and I can't wait to hear what people have to say. Also, I know Ray made an announcement about possibly doing some live streams talking to people about horror. I think that'll be super fun to just kind of hear people's perspective on horror and the spooky season. And we just appreciate any and all people who have been sharing any of our material because, between recording the episodes, editing the episodes, promoting the episodes, it's a lot of effort to put out a podcast, a lot more than I think people would probably realize. And Ray and I love doing it. And so when people actually reach out to us and say they're impacted by it and that they care about it, it means the world to both of us and just gives us the fire to keep doing it. Because if you can believe it, Ray, this was our 20th episode, my man. We've been doing this 20 weeks in a row.
Oh my gosh.
you believe that it's been that long that we started this thing? 20 weeks, Ray and I have been doing this podcast, and every single episode has just gotten more fun, and the podcast is just going to keep going up from here. Ray and I are having a wonderful time doing it, and we look forward to doing more. Like Ray said, follow us over at the Film Monsters Podcast. You can also follow us on our personal Instagram pages. You can follow Ray at Analog C and myself at My Exit Unfair, and we look forward to haunting your podcast platforms this spooky season. We appreciate you for listening.
Oh, I get to say bye. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.